Hello. So I just got a bunch of wood chips and I was reminded of questions that I'd had people ask me before about wood chips. So in this video, I want to talk about wood chips, why they're good, why they're bad, and ways to use them right and ways that you might not want to use them. So let's talk about that in this video. All right, so I just got this huge load of wood chips. And yes, call me weird. I love the smell of decomposing wood chips. It's like I don't know, kind of a funky sour smell, but I mean, you step back 20 feet, it's a kind of a sweet smell. And I think it's just from the breakdown of the wood chips, just releases different compounds that you can smell. Love that. But anyway, I've been mulching my trees. I should say my family's been helping me a lot. So got my kids out here moving wood chips around my trees. This one needs to be pulled back a little bit. So when you're mulching, one of the main things is you don't want the wood chips to be touching the trunk. You kind of want to pull it back a little bit, let the soil be exposed. You don't want that trunk to think that it's supposed to put out roots through its trunk, because you might end up rooting above the root flare. In some trees, that could actually girdle the tree. It depends on what type of thing it is. I've noticed that things like blackberry vines and elderberries, it's not really a big deal if they root that way because they don't really girdle themselves. I actually do that on purpose on my pumpkins, my pumpkin plants. I'll actually bury parts of the vine just to get more roots out of them, and you'll actually end up with bigger pumpkins. It's a strategy for getting bigger pumpkins. You don't want to do that on apple trees though. And so in this case, I'm pulling those back. The wood chips are good though. As the wood chips decompose, they'll release the nutrients in the wood chips into the soil, and they also will help to insulate the soil. And when I say insulate the soil, I'm saying insulate not just temperature-wise to keep the soil from becoming too hot or too cold, but they'll also help to keep moisture in the soil, so it'll help the soil from drying out too quickly. And I've actually had people ask me the question, well, will soil cause nitrogen to be depleted in your soil? And so that's a complicated question. So when wood chips decompose anaerobically or without oxygen, so there's aerobic aerobic decomposition and then anaerobic fermentation. And so when anaerobic fermentation happens in things like wood, you'll have bacteria that'll take that carbon source and they'll break that down. But if there's not enough oxygen to do that process, they'll actually use fixed nitrogen from the soil in the form of nitrates to donate their oxygen for that process. So if you're interested in the chemistry, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit in this video. That may or may not be something interesting to you, so I apologize if it's not interesting to you. The reason that's important is because you're going to want that to happen on the surface. These trees don't have roots on the surface, and the area where that decomposition is happening is above the roots. So you don't really have to worry about this process that's happening on the surface where carbon is decomposing using some forms of nitrates on the surface to feed that process, basically taking away fixed nitrogen in that area. My roots of my apple tree are way deeper than this process is happening, so I don't really have to worry about that being a problem. However, if you decided that you wanted to add organic material to your soil, as in when you're planting a tree, if you were to throw some wood chips in the hole, throw a tree in that hole, you might run into some problems where that might reduce by some degree some of the free fixed nitrogen available to that tree to absorb from that root area. So that's something to consider. Make sure that you're aware of what's happening in your soil. But again, like I said, that's not really, as long as you're just putting the wood chips on the surface, it's not really going to be a problem, especially if you have plants that are older than a year old. If you're putting some seeds down and then on top of those seeds you're putting wood chips, that might be a problem because those surface seeds are going to be probably deprived of some nitrogen But again, if your roots are more than a couple inches deep, not really going to be a problem. So not really something to worry about. Another thing to note though, if you would like your wood chips to decompose faster, there's things you can do. You can actually put nitrate-rich fertilizers onto a stack of wood chips to accelerate the decomposition of that pile of wood chips. And I've even heard of people adding sodium nitrate to their wood chips, or even to stumps. Like you get buy those stump removers from the store. Stump removers will usually be some type of a nitrate compound, and that acts as an oxygen source for bacteria and allows that wood to break down faster. So wood is made up of lignin and cellulose, and bacteria would love to access that source. The problem is this oxygen is usually the limiting thing. There's not enough oxygen for a huge amount of bacteria to get down there and devour those materials. But nitrate is an oxygen, basically it's oxygen stuck to nitrogen. And so bacteria have a process where they can take the oxygen from nitrate and they can use that as an oxygen source to break down the carbon in the wood chips, for example. Like you can break down the lignin and the cellulose and then use that for their chemical processes. And this type of bacteria likes to use organic materials for their food source. That's what they derive their energy from. So anyway, as long as you keep the wood chips on the surface, you're safe. Long story short, keep the wood chips on the surface. You'll have nothing to worry about, especially if it's in a perennial. Annuals, you need to be more careful, or things that have very shallow roots, things that you just started growing that same year. But like I said, if it's been growing for a few years, chances are it has pretty deep roots, and chances are the wood chips can only help, because as they decompose, the net nitrogen added to the soil is going to be positive, and so you're going to be adding nitrogen to your soil. I can hear squirrels jumping around these trees. That's hilarious. Betty? That's a cute little squirrel. Eating the crab apples. Leave some for me, Betty. Cute little thing. Not happy with me. All right, I'm going. It also helps here. This particular tree is like my nursery tree. These are all apple tree rootstocks. And I've been harvesting these rootstocks and then planting those in other spots in my yard. And what I plan on doing is using these rootstocks to host scions from these other improved varieties. I have Galas and Fujis over here. That I'll be using for scions. And then I'll graft those right onto the top of these. So I hope that answers questions you might have about mulch. Keep it on the surface. Unless your objective is to accelerate decomposition, you can actually put a little soil on top of your wood chips, or even buy cow manure that's rich in nitrates. Or it's kind of a weird story, but where I used to live, I had a big pile of wood chips in my backyard where my dogs were. And I'm not exactly sure how I got the dogs to do this, but I had this idea where if I could train my dogs to pee on the wood chip pile, it would decompose faster. So I stood on the top of the wood chip pile and called my dogs. And of course they came, or my dog at the time, I only had one dog. And my dog came to me to the wood chip pile, and the first thing he did was pee right on the top of the pile. And I'm like, perfect. Because that was my intention, was to get him to pee on the pile. And he continued peeing on that wood chip pile. And within probably less than a month, that wood chip pile was like 1/2 the size. So the decomposition was incredibly fast, just because that dog decided that he wanted to pee on the wood chip pile. So in case you don't know, urea gets converted by bacteria into nitrite, and then nitrite gets converted by bacteria into nitrate, and then nitrate quickly is used by bacteria as an oxidizer, or as an oxygen source, to break down that carbon into other compounds. And so I don't know if you guys can see that, but there's like a pillar of steam rising out of the top of this wood chip pile. It's pretty impressive. Hopefully this thing doesn't burst into flames. Add some more water just to make sure. But yeah, it rained yesterday, and so I'm having steam coming out of this pile. So this is decomposing pretty awesomely. If I take a shovel and move this out, you can actually see a lot of mycelium. You can actually see some right here. If you have a wood chip pile and you see the white, it looks like mold or ash. That's mycelium, which is like the fungal network of the fungus that's trying to colonize this pile. If I was to put a sprinkler on here, I did an experiment where I put a sprinkler on a wood chip pile and had it run like, you know, just for a minute, 3 times a day. And within a week, I had hundreds of mushroom fruiting bodies just popping out of the wood chip pile. But I don't know if that'll happen here in this case because it's just so hot. Those high temperatures will probably keep that from happening. But that's pretty crazy, the steam that's shooting out of this pile. Anyway, easy thing to do if you want. Have that in your backyard and have your dogs have access to it. Train them to pee on it if you want it to decompose fast. All right, and then there's one last thing about mulch that I want to talk about, why it's so important for your plants. So there's something called the rhizosphere. Your plants have roots, obviously, and your roots extend into the soil. And your wood chips are going to help to create that symbiotic relationship. So there's mycorrhizal fungi, myco meaning fungus, and then rhizae meaning roots. You create a connection between the root fungus and your plants, and they form a symbiotic relationship where the fungus will deliver water to the plant in the event that it needs water, because there's a symbiotic relationship going where the plant is feeding the fungus excess sugars, and in exchange the fungus will give the plant micronutrients and other things that it has in excess. And so they create that relationship where if one starts struggling, the other one, it's to its advantage to use whatever it has in excess to keep the other alive, because the other one is sharing things with it that it probably needs. Anyway, wood chips help to nurture that relationship. It helps to increase the amount of fungus you have in the soil, the amount of good fungus you have in the soil, and it creates that bond, that relationship, that friendship, where the plants are having that friendship with the fungus and the fungus is feeding the plant. So another great bonus of having those wood chips, and so I just wanted to point that out.